Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to the panelists for your contributions. Um, as I sit here, having just returned from back home and speaking to folks on the ground about the concerns that they have with things like inflation and a labor shortage, it strikes me that this bill is poorly timed for sure, and also pretends that trade-offs that are natural to the economic environment no longer hold. So, Mr. Riedel, I want to start with you, and the first one. Maybe we're just putting our head in the sand, but we seem to be buying this notion that debt to GDP no longer matters. Can you talk about the historical impacts on an economy when debt to GDP rises to the degree that ours is scheduled to based on this proposal?
Thank you for the question. There's really no historical thing to look back on because we've never had the debt go as big as it is right now. At the end of World War II, the debt hit about 108% of GDP, which was the highest we've ever had. The war ended, and so we were able to bring it back down to 25% of GDP over the next 40 years, not because we basically ran very small deficits and had economic growth. Right now, again, we are heading towards 130% of GDP by the end of this decade, and as much as 2 to 3 to 350% of GDP over the next 20 to 30 years. Now, another member had said, well, we've been hearing these warnings for a long time. Nothing like this. And the difference is the retiring baby boomers are the big driving variable. That's going to drive about $100 trillion in baseline borrowing over the next 30 years. Just the Social Security and Medicare shortfalls are going to cost $100 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So you take that and then you add on all of this new spending, and then you assume higher interest rates. There is no example of another country with a debt this big. Japan's had the biggest debt. They're at about 230% of GDP, and their economy has not grown in 30 years at 230. If we get up to 300, 350% of GDP, there's no one who's going to bail us out. And at that point, again, just the interest costs are going to bankrupt us.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more. And then there's this other myth that we keep pretending around here, which is that you can raise the corporate interest rate with no trade-off whatsoever to private sector job growth. I want you to comment specifically on single-digit margin businesses, like many of the manufacturing businesses in my district. What happens to businesses who are already running on tight margins when you jack up their tax rate?
You can put them under. And that's why the Tax Foundation and the Penn Wharton budget model have said this is going to cost jobs, reduce wages, and close businesses. According to the Tax Foundation, the construction industry, under the president's proposal, would face marginal effective rates rising from the current 18% to 24%. So here we are talking about how we want to help the construction industry. We need to build, build, build. And we're going to raise their taxes, their marginal effective tax rate by one third. It doesn't really make any sense. You're going to cost jobs, especially small margin businesses that can't afford it. I mean, this is the trade-off we face. There is no free lunch. The taxes will affect the economy.
Absolutely. The taxes will affect the economy. They're going to put hundreds, thousands of businesses and hundreds of thousands of workers potentially in my district across my state out of business. There is no free lunch. We do live in a world of trade-offs, no matter how much we want to pretend we don't. And this is a horrible, horrible idea at this point in our recovery. Finally, with my final few seconds, you correctly point out that so much of the projections are based on a faulty assumption, which is interest rates will go nowhere and will stay effectively at zero. Talk a little bit about the role of rising interest rates and our ability to pay for all of this spending.
We are doing something very dangerous, which is we tell any subprime homeowner, don't make a permanent spending commitment based on short-term adjustable interest rates. Rates are low now. There is no way they're going to stay this low. And when they rise, the whole debt's going to reset because the average maturity is only 60 months. I mentioned earlier, if interest rates rise 1 percentage point above the CBO assumption, it'll cost $30 trillion in interest over 30 years. That's 1 percentage point, which means 2 percentage points, an extra 60 trillion. We are playing with fire if we're going to gamble our fiscal future on the assumption that interest rates never rise again.
Thank you. We are playing with fire. I yield back.